Welcome to our local Arts Leaders Roundtable, sponsored by ArtsPartners of Central Illinois. I'm Mary Jo Papich, and I'm the current president of ArtsPartners, and happy to live in Peoria, and happy things are coming back, and most happy to have Alex here with us today. And we're going to have a lot of people listen to this afterwards. 9 o'clock is still early for a lot of people. So, Alex, since they all know you, I'm not going to give your bio because it was sent out and they know it. But last time we did this, you took us on a little journey of your own life, sharing your own experiences. And God knows that we definitely need more communication among all of us. And obviously, to build those bridges, we need to know more about this lifestyle and not let it be something that we're always wondering about. Last time you introduced us to terminology, cisgender, genderqueer, non-binary, and sharing how empathy is truly what you feel is the key to understanding one another and to getting more people involved in our projects and in our seats and on our boards. So please, let's talk some more. Take it away, Alex.
Hello and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. If anybody is tuning in later on the recording and you want to know a little bit more about me, you can watch the previous roundtable that is up online. So you can go and watch that, learn a little bit more about me, and hear the first part of this conversation where we did talk about gender and identity a little bit. I talked about my own journey. We talked about race, and we talked a lot about barriers that folks have to accessing the things and the events that we put on. Today, in honor of Pride Month, I want to go into a little bit more detail about LGBTQ plus terminology, the LGBTQ plus community, what Pride means, things to keep in mind for Pride Month, ways to show that you're celebrating Pride with your community and that it's not just throwing a rainbow on something to get people to come into a space, but how to actually create a safe space, how to talk about that. And then that'll sort of lead into a little bit of a conversation about intersectionality. So how does race and identity intersect? How do all these things affect the people that you want to work with, the people that do work with you? So the first thing I want to do is ask a question. Does somebody know, or does anybody know, why we celebrate Pride?
To give a more of a focus, just a more of a focus, even though we should celebrate daily, it's to give more of a focus so it doesn't get swept away, just like we celebrate jazz and African American month in like History Month in February. It's a focus for us to, if we haven't done this and understood, stop our lives and take time to understand, appreciate. Yes.
I was just gonna throw in Stonewall Uprising and the liberation movement in general.
Mm-hmm. A Black trans woman threw the first brick at Stonewall. Where our community was advocating and fighting for space because it was illegal to gather. It was illegal to gather. It has been illegal to gather. But we've been fighting for that space since the dawn of our country. If you look at William Dorsey Swann was the first documented drag queen in U.S. history. He was a former slave. They were a former slave that started hosting parties and the beginnings of what now has become ballroom culture in their house. Police would come and broke it up. They were taken to jail for keeping an unkempt home, which back then was code for running a brothel, which they weren't, but it was the only way the police could charge them for gathering because they didn't want them to gather. And William Dorsey Swann took it to President Grover Cleveland and petitioned the president. They lost, but even after they got out of jail, they kept gathering, they kept hosting these things. So since the dawn of our country, we've been fighting for space, which is unfortunate because these identities, a lot of this stuff feels like it's new, but something you all need to keep in mind is it's not. People who are trans, people who are non-binary, people who are agender, which I'll go into the definitions a little bit later. People who identify all kinds of ways have always existed. Different cultures have had different terminology, different ideas, different faiths and beliefs that support these identities for eons. It's just now in our modern day society, we have enough terminology to talk about it more. And we're also looking more reflectively back at our history, back at what came before, and seeing that we've always been here. Just like if you look at there's a huge upsurgence in like looking at women in art, women in music, women in performance. It's not because they didn't exist and we need to find more. It's because they weren't documented. They weren't records weren't kept. You have to work really hard. When I was teaching American art history, I have to work really hard to find colonial painters that were women and find the work that was saved, that was done by women, because we didn't try to preserve those voices. That's why when we do Black History Month, it is a reframing. It should, again, celebrate every day, celebrate all year, but it's a reframing to remind us that like we've always been here, we've always been doing things. It's to call that to attention. That's what Pride Month is. It's that celebration. It's that celebration of the anniversary of us fighting for our space. But it's also to remind folks that we've always existed. How many of you are familiar with the Legacy Project? So going into schools, actually at work, my boss is working a lot on this with people from Holt Center for Healthy Living, but they are bringing in LGBTQ plus history. And a lot of people are like, why do I have to know about this? Why do I need to do this thing? Why do we have to learn about this year round, blah, blah, blah. All of that feedback, which is homophobia, transphobia, it's a lot of internalized hate that they're projecting outward, or a lot of hate for our community, when in reality, this project is just a reframing of what we already learned. These people's identities are left out and forgotten. In school, we don't talk about famous trans folks. We don't talk about people like we could say, oh, this was a famous war general, but also, did you know that he was a trans man? Or Martin Luther King's assistant and the person organizing the things, a gay man. People don't know that because it is kept out of history. Malcolm X, a bisexual person. No one knows that. And so that's what this Legacy Project is reframing and just reminding folks, like it's stopping that omission of the truth. Which is why this feels new, which is why we as a community get pushback. We want to be integrated into spaces, because they don't want to see that. They think it's something new. They think this is a fad. They think this is a trend. And it's not. We've existed forever. We've always been around. It's just trying to reclaim that history, which is unfortunate that a community has to do that to show that they've existed. It's get a PhD in history and pull up records to prove that they've always been there, but it's what we have to do. So before I get into, I have some printouts today with some terminology that I'm going to go through, and I really want to leave space with this conversation, because I talked a lot last time, but I want to leave a lot of space for conversation and question this time. But before I get into terminology, I want to talk a little bit about ways to make a safe space at your events, at your venues, in your organizations. I mentioned this the last conversation we had, but something as simple as putting pronouns on your email tag lets people know that this is safe, that they can share. Like if I go somewhere, I get feedback or flack all the time when I introduce myself and my pronouns to people. We end up having to have a conversation about that. But when I get an email from somebody I've never met and I see their pronoun, even if they're a cisgender person, which again, cisgender means sex assigned at birth matches with their gender identity. And if I see their pronouns in their email, it's a sigh of relief. I'm like, okay, they're going to ask this question, or they're going to look for my pronouns in my email, and I'm going to be respected immediately. And that's something that a lot of folks who are cisgender don't have to worry about that. Like if you're a cisgender woman and you have a name that sounds remotely feminine, you don't have to worry about being misgendered. You don't have to worry. It's not a stress that you ever have to think about. And so for trans populations and for LGBTQ plus folks in general, seeing that on there automatically is a sigh of relief. When you're having a space, like if you have a public space and you're putting on an event, trying to get restrooms that are gender neutral. It's weird trying to find a bathroom sometimes to use in public, because people, like for me, people will look at me no matter what restroom I go into. They have questions no matter which bathroom I walk into. And so if I'm doing a space, like we used to do this at Bradley, if we had a space that didn't have gender neutral restrooms, we would just make our own signs and hang them up on the door during the event, and then would leave and take the signs down and keep those with us to put up anywhere we held an event, just to make space. That makes people so much more comfortable. They aren't afraid of going somewhere. Or if you're in the foundations of building a space, make private bathrooms. That is, if you're ever in the groundworks of a project, try to get bathrooms that are a little bit more isolated, a little bit more private. I have heard from many an international friend that our bathrooms in America are too exposed anyway. But having just space where someone can go and feel safe, like it is as simple as that. Putting up signs, or if you work in a venue where you can be like, hey, can we get some gender neutral signs for this restroom? Or I've even seen spaces that have like gender neutral signs, but then they'll be like, this restroom has urinals, if that's something you can use. Or just they'll say like gender neutral and then like urinal underneath, just so like if folks who can use those want to use them, they can. And things like that just make a space that much more comfortable. If you're doing something that has like an event, like a round table like this, and everybody has name tags, get the name tags that have a little spot for pronouns. Or lots of local organizations give out free pronoun pins. People love that. We did the last week, we participated in the Slut Walk, and PHS was there giving out pronoun pins, and those are super popular. You can see, like I saw lots of queer youth opening up in the space where it's like maybe at school and stuff, they're quiet or they're afraid. But in that space, seeing people of a variety of gender identities and a variety of backgrounds showing up, wearing these pins, sharing their stories, these students opened up and they felt safe. And so things as simple as that is just putting out there that you're an ally, making space for folks makes it that much better. And like speaking from personal experience, I cannot convey the relief that that creates for people like me, for people in my community. You don't like, because we live with this, we live with it every day. You don't realize how much you're carrying on your shoulders until you go to a space where you can breathe. And it's like, it's unreal. And like things as simple as that can make space and leave room for conversation, make people feel comfortable. And when you're meeting people in those spaces, when you've done that work to bring in those communities, to bring in those people, getting them involved in your organization, having, like the last conversation, having representation from the ground up in your organization. When you get people in that space, trusting and believing their truth because they know their identity better than you do. I don't mind being an educator. I like having conversations like this. I like teaching people. But someone shouldn't have to give a dissertation on how they identify. If they introduce themselves, their pronouns, that's all you need to know about them. You know how to address them. You know how to become their friend now. And like through friendship, through conversation, you may learn more about their identity. But when someone, if you are like a straight and cisgender person, when someone walks up to you and you introduce yourself, they don't ask you to explain your identity. They want to know more about you. Like, what do you do? What do you like doing? What do you do for work? What kind of projects are you involved in? They don't say like, oh, well, how do you know you're a woman? Or how do you know you're a man? That's a weird conversation. And so just after you make space and open up space for people, just let them live in their truth and believe them, because they know. And like also know that things are fluid, things change, identity changes. We learn more about ourselves every day. So if someone comes to you at one point and says they're this, but then a year or so down the road, they're like, actually, I've learned more about myself, and this is who I am now. Believe that journey, believe that truth, because we as a community are forced to think about that a lot, like who we are, where we're at, because we have to convey that to people. And so like it's a journey, which brings me to my first sort of terminology. This is going to be backwards for you all because these are printouts and I cannot find the digital files anywhere to share. But coming out. How many have you all heard the phrase like someone's coming out, someone's sharing this part of themselves? People think that coming out is a one-time occurrence. It's like a baby shower. It's like, guess what? This is my truth and I'm proclaiming it to the world. Which sometimes I've seen things like that happen for coming outs, but it's not a stagnant one-time thing. Coming out is an everyday occurrence for a person. Sometimes it's like the actual definition of coming out is like when someone accepts or identifies with their gender identity or sexual orientation within themselves. So you come out to yourself first. When someone accepts that within themselves, and then step two is the willingness to share that with others, or being in a safe enough space to share that with others. And it's not a one-time occurrence, because say you meet someone who's bold and confident in their identity and they come out, they share that with the world. Well, every new space they're in, every new job they have, every new class they go in as a student, every new art event they go to, every new time they interact with new people, they come out. The moment I share my pronouns with somebody, I have to come out to them. Even if I don't know them, for me to live my truth, I have to come out to strangers every single day. And everyone in the LGBTQ plus community, it's not a stagnant one-time thing. It's something that happens all the time. Every space you're in, you have to be worried of like, am I going to be accepted here? Is this safe enough? So all those fears that they have from coming out the first time, happens all the time. And then also with coming out, it's not like, this is my truth now, and this is it. You learn more about yourself as you grow. You learn more about yourself as you learn new terminology. There's a documentary recently where they were interviewing butch lesbians, which butch is a term used a lot in the community for someone who's more masculine of center. So that means they lead with their masculinity, or they present more masculinely. And there were a few butch lesbians who, one of them was saying, I never really identified as a woman. I identified as a lesbian. And there was another person who, she was like in her 80s, I think. And she was like, I've lived my life now as a butch lesbian woman. But like, if people were having the conversations that they're having now when I was a kid, I probably would have come out as a trans man, because people are having the conversation, because this is happening more. But that's why representation is so important. She had shared that like she lived her life. She wasn't going to change now, but hearing this conversation more, she's like, oh, if this was happening when I was younger, I definitely would have transitioned. I definitely would have changed. And that just shows that it's a journey. It shows that it's something you learn more and more about. I didn't know non-binary was a thing. I didn't know genderqueer was a thing. And like, here I am living in that, but it was because of these conversations. It was because of these opportunities to learn that I felt and found a word that I could share with other people that sort of highlighted how I feel, which is what a lot of this is. It's not, you can't capture the complexity of existence. You can't capture the complexity of the fullness of a person in one word. Like, I don't know if you all have ever had an issue of like, you feel uncomfortable being labeled, like, oh, I'm an artist, or, oh, I'm a teacher, or, oh, I'm this. Like, adding that one thing feels very one-dimensional, and can be kind of uncomfortable. And identity works like that, where the terminology we use is just to help you better understand someone's experience. My identity isn't wrapped up in the words trans, non-binary. Trans, non-binary is how I convey to you all what I'm feeling in a way that you can understand, that other people can understand that experience. So I have a list of some words to go through. I'm not going to go through all of them, but before I do that, does anybody have any questions or things they want to add, things they want to ask before I go through some of this terminology?
I kind of have a question, and also I just want to say thank you for the suggestion on bathroom terminology, especially in spaces where that can't happen permanently, but like the suggestion of adding something just during events, I think is a really great like loophole to that. Because there are so many things in place that we won't be able to always, like we can push against it and we can try our best, but I think finding a solution in the meantime is like it was just a really great suggestion. So I appreciate that. But I'm just curious about some of your thoughts on ways that we can, as artists and art organizers, also bring this conversation to the younger generations who are coming into finding themselves also. So not just artists, adult artists, but also younger artists in our communities. So any thoughts on that too?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. The easiest way to do it is just through representation. Like you hear representation is important, but having someone from the community speak at an event, bringing in artists of different backgrounds, different identities. That's why, like in the Guild of Black Artists, that's our big thing, is like showing youth that there are Black creatives in the community, showing youth of Peoria that art's a valid option just by existing and sharing space. So like as organizations, facilitating conversations like this, facilitating conversations with people of different upbringings, people of different backgrounds, and making those open to the public, showing LGBTQ plus artists, showing artists from different spaces, and letting folks see that. Now on a more like direct approach, having children's events and having events that are geared towards our younger audiences that feature artists or that feature musicians or that feature people from the LGBTQ plus community. Because again, representation is so big. Like as an adult, I'm a nerd. I love comic books. I love animation. And seeing the shows being made now with people like me, I cry watching cartoons because I can see myself in them. Whereas a kid, you have to make up these narratives, you have to make up these stories. And like just seeing that as an option, seeing that as something that is not only normal, but like celebrated, means the world to the LGBTQ plus population, but also shows children that like that's out there and that exists and people like that exists. Sometimes we get a lot of pushback of like with this legacy project, we get pushback of, I don't want my kids learning about this. Like, what if that makes them gay? Or what if that makes them do this? And it's like, that's not what it's doing. It's not forcing kids to be something they're not. What folks are afraid of is that they'll see that there's people out there happily existing in their truth, and that will give their kids the power to do that. And so you all as organizers have the ability to give kids so much strength just through how you organize events, just through who you bring in. And so use that gift, use that power to help kids find a voice. Like I do a lot of like drag queen story hour, and I, again, teared up again, read a book called The Prince and the Knight. It's about a prince who can't find the right princess. And then he meets a knight who's trying to save the kingdom from a dragon, and they fall in love. And I almost started running. My makeup started running because I was like, this book, it's not gender discourse. It's not discourse on sexuality. It's just a little kid's fairy tale, and a knight and a prince fall in love. And like reading that to a room full of kids who are like, oh my gosh, he met a prince. That's why he met a knight that he loves. That's what was happening. Those princesses weren't right for him. Like hearing 2- and 3-year-olds say that, they already know what they need to know. It's not a hard conversation to have. Like in my own personal life, I'm starting to have this conversation with my nieces of like, you're your uncle. I'm Alex, and you are my nieces and I love you. But we're trying to navigate that space, or at least show them that, like, if they call me like Uncle Alex, it's like more of a term of endearment and has nothing to do with like identity. So we're having these conversations, but like my nieces are 3 and 7. So we're having them differently than like I would have with you all, but they listen and they learn. And so things like that, creating opportunities like that, and just having that representation is huge. And then coordinating events where people can speak, where people can share space, and being present in the community. So like coming to Pride events, finding out ways to volunteer with local LGBTQ+ organizations, getting folks, like if you're doing outreach to schools, getting folks like through work, I go and teach a lot of classes on gender and sexuality, and I teach classes on sexual health. They asked me to do that because a lot of students of color in these schools were seeing lots of cisgender, straight, white nurses. And so they're like, well, we need a transgender, queer, Black person, to teach about their own community, but then also so that students can see that we exist within our community, and try to undo the damage done by keeping representation away from kids, but showing that we exist. But yeah, sorry, that was a really long answer to your question, but that's how I would say, like as organizations, that's something you can start doing today. Well, thank you. So before I go through some terminology again, does anybody have any other questions? Because that one was a really good one. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you all is LGBT, or LGBTQ, LGBTQ+. Have you all heard any other acronyms used before? It can get really long sometimes.
LGBTQ plus IA. Yeah, okay, Jess already.
Yeah. So LGBTQIA plus is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. And then the plus is everything that doesn't fit in that acronym, which, fun bit of history, I just learned that it used to be GLBT, which I've seen like old organizations have. But the reason it's LGBT is because in the 70s and 80s during the HIV crisis, lesbians were a huge asset to the community and did so much work to protect us. And the acronym got rearranged, which is where we have the LGBTQ plus we see before you. There's more history behind that you can look up, but I just found that out recently. So this is going to be backwards for you all, but this is something we use a lot at work. And so we have the queer umbrella. So the Q in LGBTQ plus stands for queer. Queer is an umbrella term that a lot of us use because these identities aren't singular. Just like no one is like, I am a accountant and that's it. It's like, no, you're an accountant, you're a mother, you're a cousin, you're a artist, you're a creative. Like there's so many things that you are. Oh, it's not backwards. Thank you, man. Perfect. But we use this as an umbrella term that all members of the community use, especially if they don't know exactly where they fit under yet or what word best describes them. So queer is used as an umbrella term a lot. It's also used as a term to reference the community as a whole, like you have queer studies, queer history. So it's a good catch-all. Like those of you who know me for a while, I used to identify as, I still use the term queer a lot because I'm a very queer person, but I used to use the term queer when talking about myself a lot more because I hadn't come out yet as trans. I hadn't learned to express that accurately yet. And so queer was a good space to exist in where it's like, I know I'm something, but I don't know yet. So this is what I'm going to give to you, which is also why I stopped using, like, again, earlier we talked about coming out being a journey. First time I came out, I was like, oh, I'm gay. And then I was like, no, that's not it. And like, I even had had a hard time being like, I'm a gay man, I guess. Like, that was hard to say. And so I was like, I'm queer. That's all I need to know. And now I'm like, oh, that's why, because I'm not a gay man. I'm a queer trans person. But so it's an umbrella term. LGB, the lesbian, gay, and bisexual, are the sexualities in that under that umbrella. Which sexuality is who you are romantically or physically attracted to. So lesbian is someone who identifies as female. Like, this is how, so it's not just a woman who likes a woman. It's someone who identifies as a woman who is attracted to other people who identify as women. Someone who is gay is someone who identifies as a man who's attracted to other people who identify as men. Bisexual is someone who is attracted to more than one gender. They usually say attracted to people who are their own gender identity and another, to make it two. Another terminology that pops up a lot is pansexual, which, if you think of Pangea, when we were all one big continent, pan is all. So pan is someone who is attracted to somebody regardless of gender. And so there's like discourse within the community of like, well, all bisexual people are technically pansexual, or all like, which way does it go? It just depends on the person's preference. If someone tells you that's what they are, that's what they are. But textbook definition wise, we usually say bisexual, their own gender and another, pansexual, all gender. So that falls under the sexualities. And so it's who they are romantically attracted to, which romantic attraction is, because there's different kinds of attraction when you're talking about life in general, but the LGBTQ plus community. Romantic attraction is like who you want to be romantic with, who you see as a partner or partners, who you want to share parts of your life with. Sexual attraction is who you are physically attracted to. When you see someone that you've never met before and you get butterflies, that's physical attraction or sexual attraction. There's a few other things that it could be too, but like when you see someone you've never met before and you're like, whew, physical attraction. When you have someone you've known for a while and they do something in just the unique way they do and you get butterflies, that's romantic attraction. So that's how I tell it to students. I'm like, if you've been with someone for a while, like if you have a pen pal that you've been writing for years and you've never met in person, but you fall in love with them through their letters, that's romantic attraction. You may not even know what they look like, but you've fallen in love with them and their personality. Whereas if you have a crush, I tell them if you walk down the hallway and there's a new kid at school and you see them and your heart stops, physical attraction. And then there are people, that's where the A in LGBTQIA, asexual, or the ACE spectrum. There are people who don't experience that physical attraction or romantic attraction. There's aromantics, which means they don't experience romantic attraction, or asexuals, which mean they don't experience sexual attraction. I attended an ACE panel a few years ago, and these folks on it were saying a lot of people misconstrue that being asexual means they never have sex, or they don't do this, or they don't do that, which isn't true. There's ACE people who have full families, and you have to do certain things to have family. But they just don't experience that physical attraction to people. I watched a woman in this panel explain made it a metaphor that kind of stuck with me of like, depending on the person, they can still get urges, they can still get things, but they don't experience. It's like you're hungry and you go to the fridge, but nothing really looks good. You're going to eat because you're hungry, but nothing in the fridge looks like what you want. Whereas for another person, you may go and look at like, oh, wow, that food looks really good, or these leftovers look really good. You're being drawn to those things. Whereas for an ACE person, they're going to suit a desire or suit a need, but they aren't feeling that draw to those things. And then T, transgender. We use transgender as an umbrella term as well, because it encompasses a lot. So the go-to definition a lot of us use is if someone is transgender, they don't identify with the sex they are assigned at birth. Even though we know now as adults that gender and sex are separate things, if someone is told they're a boy when they're born and they grow up and they're like, that's not right, they're trans. Now, some people use that term more than others. Like I've met non-binary folks who don't identify as trans. For me, I do because my experience, my identity doesn't match what the doctor told me I was. Like, even again, like earlier when I was saying, like, I used to identify as a gay man, that is kind of hard for me to say sometimes because it's not who I am. Like, it feels weird. And so I'm like, okay, my identity doesn't match what the doctor said I was when I was born. You go under that trans umbrella. And just some etiquette, you can call someone a trans man, trans woman, trans person, transgender woman, transgender man, transgender person, but no one is transgendered. It's not, doesn't work that way. It's grammatically incorrect. It's also rude. So a good safe bet, I always tell people if they get confused, just say trans, insert identifier. It's the safest way to do it. But that incorporates lots of different identities. Again, non-binary people are underneath there. Demi folks, which I'll give you all I'll scan this list in so you all can have access to it and read some of those definitions. Oh, can I talk a little bit about outdated language? Yes. So within the community, well, one more thing before I do that. The I, if you hear LGBTQIA+, I is for intersex. So intersex individuals are folks who we are learning now that even sex is not a binary. It's not you're born with this or you're born with that. There's a variety, very common variety of genetics, hormone balances, things like that can cause someone to be what is not typically textbook associated with male sex or female sex. And that's what an intersex individual is. And there's a variety of cases. People can be born with extra chromosomes. People can have hormone variation in their body. People can be born with different kinds of genitalia. There's lots of different ways that intersex manifests itself. And actually, a lot of people, it's really, really common, but a lot of people don't know that they're intersex. The leader of it's like a national, the Intersex something alliance, was a woman who her whole life they were like, you're dying of ovarian cancer, you have these issues, like there's nothing we can do. She was panicking. This happened when she was like in her 30s or 40s, and she was like, what do you mean, like I've had these pains my whole life and now you're just telling me like I'm going to die from it? What's going on? Doctors couldn't figure out. Well, turns out she was intersex. She had other organs inside of her that everyone just thought was a growth or thought was something else, because a lot of doctors sort of ignore intersex folks and a lot of them fall victim to medical malpractice. But it's super common. We just don't, just like now we have to reclaim our history. We forget about intersex people because doctors just write it off, or they'll be like, okay, you can choose. Like, what do you want your child? Which is damaging to a child, damaging to a baby. You shouldn't do physical alterations to them when they're born. And so that actually is a perfect segue into talking about outdated terminology. So like terminology used for the intersex community, people used to say hermaphrodite. That is not a proper term to use anymore. We use that term in like biology, botany, things to say something is hermaphroditic, but that's for plants and critters, not for people. So someone is intersex. Other things you may have heard, I'm going to get you all this list. I'll send it to Kenny so he can email it to everyone who attended, because this list has some outdated terminology as well. I think if this is the right one. But like, especially things like within the trans community, like we say transgender, again, because their gender doesn't match the sex assigned at birth, but some of you may have grown up hearing the word transsexual. That is something we don't use anymore. Now, some people do. You'll meet older members of the community that use that word because that's what they grew up in. That's how they identify. But they can use that. Like no one else can. So outside of the community, transgender is the proper term. They aren't, there's other terminology associated that people get mixed up, like cross-dresser, which that is actually a term still used by some people because they aren't someone who identifies as trans. Their identity is still, like they could still be cisgender, but they dress in what is typically associated with another gender. That's what we say for cross-dressers. That is something that's not used a lot, but some people still identify in that. And again, if someone's telling you that's how they identify, you respect that journey, but it's a little bit outdated. Other things that like a little, not bad, but just a little bit outdated. Don't really say sex reassignment surgery that's on this list, or you say like sex change. It's not really, you say gender confirmation surgery, because you get something that confirms who you are to other people, makes you feel more at home in your body. It's gender confirmation surgery. Some people in the community say top and bottom surgery, but safest bet, most polite terminology is gender confirmation surgery, because that can be lots of things. That can be a mastectomy, that could be breast augmentation, that can be a list of anything that makes someone feel more at home in their identity. And it doesn't have to be, yes, affirmative language. It doesn't have to be anything, because that's also a misconception. It's like trans folks are going to get surgery or going to take HRT, which is hormone replacement therapy. That isn't true. There's plenty of trans people who are perfectly at home and like their body, and they don't want to do those things. Like because the moment someone comes out, like if someone were to come out to you as a trans woman, they are just as much of a woman then as they will be after anything they have done, after any hormone therapy they do, after anything. I tell that to my young queer students all the time. Like if they come out to me, they're like, oh, I think I'm a woman. I'm like, well, congratulations for sharing, and thank you for sharing that with me. And like we've had conversations about like work they get done. I'm like, you're just as much of a woman now as you will be 10 years from now, as you were 10 years ago. Nothing changes who you are. It's whatever you share with folks. Saying things like gender confirmation, like there's just misconceptions that trans people are always going to get surgery, or always going to get hormone therapy. Like for me, I am not. I'm not. I do not experience dysphoria anymore after coming out. And so I know I'm not going to do things, at least not at this juncture, that could change down the road. But like I'm a trans person who doesn't want to take hormone replacement therapy, or doesn't want to get gender confirmation surgery, because I don't experience dysphoria. The folks who do, dysphoria is like, it's not feeling at home in your body. Folks who experience dysphoria will like look at their shoulders, look at like their facial hair, look at something, and it makes them ill. Like it does not feel good. It's I don't know how better to explain it aside from like you just don't feel at home in your body. It feels like there's lots of writing you can read, lots of poetry and short stories written by trans individuals talking about dysphoria. But that's why folks get gender confirmation surgery, because they feel trapped. It feels like someone else. It's like wearing a Halloween costume, but all the time. Like people aren't seeing you, they're seeing this vessel, and it's thinking that's your whole truth, because it's like they aren't seeing your truth. And so that's why if you hear someone talking about dysphoria, that's why folks get confirmation surgery, to like combat dysphoria, to feel more at home in their body, and to make their body reflect to the outside world who they are. Because inside, all of us, our soul, our brain, our heart, whatever you want to call it, is where that truth lies. Like that's why you come out to yourself first. But outwardly, you sometimes want to do things to reflect that. It can be through confirmation surgery. It can be through clothing. It can be through anything, but you want to express that to the outside world. Like for me, again, I don't really experience dysphoria, at least not anymore after coming out, but there are ways I could dress that would make me incredibly uncomfortable, and I wouldn't want to do that. Because it feels like a lie. It feels like I'm performing something I'm not. And so that's not the same, but it's in that boat of like, this is how I express who I am to the world. Like I'm a visibly queer person. And so this is how I feel affirmed and safe. So that there's a whole lot. Again, I'm going to give this list to Kenny. I'm going to scan it in at work today so I can share it with you all. But are there any questions before we leave? Because we are approaching about 5 minutes left. Are there questions? And like really anything. This is a safe space, so please feel free to ask anything. There's no such thing as a dumb question, but if there's anything you want to know or terminology you've heard, you want to know if it's okay to use or like anything like that, please let me know.
Alexander, I have learned so much, and I think getting people familiar with terminology is a challenge that we all need to help with. Question: why is the simple term of cisgender such a unknown term?
I think it's because it's the status quo. If you have a bunch of white men documenting history, they aren't going to talk there. You're not going to know it's from the perspective of a bunch of white men. Now we know. But I think it's folks haven't had to explain themselves, and they think like they set a tone of like what is the norm, which there is no norm. There is no status quo. And so no one's had to do that. But now we use this conversation to sort of diffuse that and be like, being cisgender isn't the norm. That is just who you are. Just like being trans isn't abnormal. That's just who we are. And so I think just a lot of people don't know that word because they haven't had to look at themselves in a context outside of being dominant.
Any other questions, comments?
But Jessica said, do you think there's something like straight fragility, like there is white fragility? I do think there is, in the sense that there's backlash from straight folks who feel like, well, if this, like, who are used to, again, being that sort of status quo. So when the conversation shifts from that, they're like, no, wait a minute. And so I think there's backlash in that sense where folks are like, why do people, why do you have to celebrate Pride? Like, why do you get to do this? Why do you get to do that? And it's like, well, we haven't had a space to do that at all. And we're just celebrating who we are because we're trying to survive, trying to live. And you didn't have to do that in the same context. And so I think I haven't heard the term straight fragility used, but I've seen straight fragility happen. I mean, that's why you have people trying to have straight pride parades because they don't know the history. They don't know the culture. They don't know why we do what we do. And so they're like, well, I want to be celebrated. And so I think, yes, I think that is that's a real thing that happens. I just haven't heard it used that way. So maybe it's a term you can coin now because it definitely does happen.
Thank you. This once again was so informative, and it comes from a special place. It comes from the heart and your real journey. I don't know how anyone couldn't be absolutely touched by this and learn from it. Alexander, you're an amazing teacher because you do it so easily. You're so very knowledgeable, and you do it delicately but firmly and strongly. It's making such a difference. So keep doing it.